All right. Well, so what we got left to do is we've got two chapters in the chronological narrative, 19 and 20, and we'll wrap up the kind of story of Samuel. And then I will tell you, I'll just give you, we're not going to get into First Kings. I'll tell you like just briefly what happens in First Kings, but you certainly can go and read it for yourself, and hopefully, you have better tools to be able to know what's going on there. And then we'll get into these appendix stories, which are interesting, but in a different kind of way. I'll explain that um, when we get there. It's not merely just an afterthought. Like it's strange, but there's a lot of depth there. We'll get into that when we get there. So so when we left off, okay, David's third son Absalom rebels. uh, David has to flee from Jerusalem. David, where we left him, is in Mahanaim, and Absalom was killed somewhere in the wilderness of Ephraim and Manasseh. David gets a report that Absalom is dead, and he mourns for Absalom. And it's one of the more moving passages in the Bible. Of course, there's David experiences the grief, not for the first time in his life, the grief of a parent having to bury his child, but also too, there's also this kind of like, on one level, it's very moving, but on another level, it's kind of like, well, you still are kind of ignoring all this bad stuff that he did, right? And so we got to tie up some loose ends, and then David has to make his way back to Jerusalem, and that's pretty much where the narrative ends. But it's an adventure getting there. So let's just dive in. So we're in chapter 19. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son, Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" So obviously, like, yeah, we get it. But at the same time, it's like, you don't want your victorious army that just won a civil war for you downcast. It's like something's a little off here, right? So Joab is going to step in. Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I perceive that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose, took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. So again, yeah, David's mourning for Absalom is obviously terrible for the morale of those who are loyal to him and risk their lives for him. And Joab is one of the few characters we've seen who's willing to call David out. Joab is as you've seen, a very complex character. I don't even know. I don't know how. I mean, again, that's the beauty of the Bible, and that's the beauty of why we're diving into this stuff. I think when we're children, rightly so, just in general, but especially with Bible stories, you separate into good guys and bad guys, and you need that for children, right? I don't think you don't need to introduce a whole lot of ambiguity for children, right? There's good guys and bad guys, because on a basic level, you start there. But the Bible is very complex, right? These characters are complex. Why? Because you and I are complex. It's not just a matter of good guys and bad guys. And Joab certainly falls in that. So, I mean, he has a point here. There's also a passive threat here from Joab as well, right? Like, if you don't because who's really good and talented at commanding the loyalty of a group, especially military? Joab is, right? And Joab seems to be content with being the commander of the military, but he's got a point. And so David takes up his place at the gate, of Mahanaim, and kind of takes up his post, right? He's like, I gotta put aside my personal feelings for my traitorous son, and I need to be there for the people who are actually loyal to me. I mean, again, Joab's words are pretty stinging there, right? You hate those who love you and love those who hate you, right? So again, it's a complex thing. Like on one hand, very moving. We feel for David, and he also again feels that responsibility that like I've brought this about, not that I'm the one who rebelled against myself, but like my sin and my bad fatherhood is what allowed this evil to happen, and not just to me but to all these people, right? So he's the mourning Adam, the one Adam and Eve recognizing, they're responsible in a sense when Cain kills Abel, not directly but through what they allowed, what they let in. All right, so continuing there. Now Israel had fled, every man to his own home. Israel meaning Absalom's rebellious army, right? Okay. And again, there's undertones here of the future split in the kingdom that's going to happen. The 10 tribes in the north are going to rebel against the 2 tribes in the south. And all the people were at strife throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hands of our enemies and saved us from the hands of the Philistines. And now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" So, what's going on there? It's foreshadowing that split, that rebellion, okay? And that's going to happen under David's grandson, Rehoboam. But again, that's where like it's never simple. It's not just a matter of, well, it was all united under David and Solomon, and then all of a sudden it just went to hell in the handbasket. No, I mean the tension is still there, right? The Israelites who rebelled against, I mean there were those in Judah who joined Absalom, but a lot of the people were from the northern 10 tribes. And so again, even within, like, thinking about our own country's history, talking about our own civil war, it's not like in the 1860s everybody just decided, you know what, we hate each other now, right? It was like, no, you could actually see the seeds of what led to the Civil War long before. And so that's the same case here, right? And it's gonna, yeah. So that tension was gonna come to a head in a second here. All right. So verse 11, and King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. These are the priests that were stayed in Jerusalem. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king? You are my kinsman. You are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? So David, who's up here, not in Jerusalem, is saying to the people of his own tribe, hey, bring me back, right? Like, and again, I'm sure like there's a few things here, financially, protection, it's an operation to get David and his everything that goes with the royal court back to Jerusalem, but also maybe extending a little bit of an olive branch, especially for those who rebelled against him, like, hey, bring me back. Okay. Notice too, and remember when David was originally crowned king, that he said, that language of bone and flesh, which goes back to Adam and Eve, right? Like there's a kind of marriage, kinship here, right? And so David is saying to the people of Judah, bring me back to Jerusalem. Why aren't you guys helping me out here? And say to Amasa, and Amasa, remember, is he was the Absalom's general. Okay. Are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of my army henceforth in place of Joab. So here's part of his olive branch, right? So Amasa, who is related, I think, it's his nephew. That's another one of David's nephew, but his mother is not the same sister as Joab's mother, right? So a nephew is part of a different family. He sided with Absalom. David is going to promote him in commander of place of Joab. Okay, why? Two things. Well, probably to win back the Judahites who supported Absalom, but also he's demoting Joab. Why? because Joab was the one who stabbed Absalom and deliberately disobeyed David's orders, right? David doesn't upbraid Joab personally, right? At least not in the narrative. But what he does do is takes away the one position that Joab really wants, which is to be the military commander. So even though Joab calls him out, right, he sticks it to him by putting his cousin in place of the army, head of the army. And he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, "Return, both you and all your servants." So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. So here's Gilgal, here's the Jordan River. So David comes down here. People of Judah are coming to receive him again. Okay. So we have the kind of restoration of David as king. Okay. Shimei meets David and is forgiven. Verse 16. And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite. So, well, before I go into this, what we're going to have happen is we're going to kind of have a reversal of what, remember the different figures that David met on his way out of Jerusalem? We're going to have a reversal of that, and he's going to kind of re-meet those figures and tie up those loose ends. Because remember, different people had different reactions to him when he was down, right? Some people were mocking him. Some people were kind of indifferent, right? And some people were fiercely loyal to him. So now he's back in power. So how is he going to deal with each of those people? So we're going to tie up those loose ends here. Okay, so Shimei, he was the guy who was a Benjaminite of the house of Saul, and he was the one who mocked David and threw rocks at him. Okay, so how is David going to deal with him? And Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim, made haste to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. He's like, right? And with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king. He was another figure David met, right? Remember, he was the servant of Mephibosheth, who said, "Hey, did you hear that Mephibosheth was like rejoicing that you're out of town. He's going to get his kingdom back. Oh, and by the way, I brought you all these donkeys and nice food." And David's like, "All right, I'm giving the land back to you, right? You don't have to be his servant anymore. You control the land." And Ziba rushed down to the Jordan before the king, and they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan, and said to the king, by the way, this is the same, more or less, the same spot in the Jordan where Israel crossed over initially with Joshua. It's also the same spot in the Jordan, more or less, where Christ was baptized, right? We're right here, okay? So the fact that David is, again, he's taking back his kingdom, right? We're looking both backward and forward, again, as we've been doing with David this whole time, okay? And he said he's about to cross, and Shimei's like, not even letting him cross before he's going to try to, hey, And he said to verse 19, and he said to the king, "Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Let not the king bear it in mind." Hey, sorry for mocking you and throwing rocks at you, right? What's his excuse? "For your servant knows that I have sinned." He actually doesn't really make an excuse, right? "Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down and meet the Lord the king." House of Joseph, I think what he's saying there is a shorthand of like the northern tribes, right? Because he is from the tribe of Benjamin, right? So it's kind of, but what he's saying, right? What's the conflict, or what's the that's why these conversations that we're hearing among the people, the people of Israel are like, "Hey, like, should we welcome him back to Jerusalem and bring him as king?" And David goes to the people of Judah and says, "Hey, are you going to bring me back or what?" And it's Judah is doing it. So he's saying like, "Hey, I'm the first out of the people of Israel, the people in the 10 northern tribes who are coming to, greet you back as king," right? He's trying to win favor. Okay. The first of all the house of Joseph to come down to meet my lord the king. Abishai, so this is Joab's brother, David's nephew, the son of Zeruiah, answered, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? He was also the one who wanted to put him to death on the way up, right? So what does David do? But David said, what have I to do with you, the sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. So here we have David, right, who's been humbled. Here is he's a man here of clemency and mercy. I mean, he had every right to put Shimei to death, not only because of what he did to him, but also he's a potential threat, right? If he's still, but David's like, I'm secure enough in my own self as king, right? And I trust in God, and like, I'm gonna this guy. I'm not worried about him, right? And he has mercy on him, right? So here, again, we see a kind of, I would say, moral progress of David, who chooses to forgive. Okay. But I should say, because I did put this in here, on his deathbed. So this is part of the First Kings stuff that we're not going to look at. On his deathbed, David will remind Solomon of Shimei's treachery and does suggest executing him. So, I mean, it's a little bit of a, for now, right? But when he's giving advice to his son, he's like, hey, remember that guy? He's in trouble. You should probably just off him, right? Okay. So, anyway. But for the purposes of this narrative, right, he shows forgiveness and clemency and mercy. Okay. All right, now we're going to deal with, okay, so we dealt with the guy who was like, ultimate, cursing David and was against him. Now we're going to deal with that kind of ambiguous story, okay, the ambiguous characters, which was Mephibosheth and Ziba. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came back to safety. So, I don't know, weeks, months, right? Like what are these? Signs of mourning, right? He hasn't been taking care of himself. He is in active mourning. He's not rejoicing that David left. He has a different side of the story than Ziba did, okay? And when he came from Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? Like, why weren't you with me? Where were you the day we were leaving? Okay. He answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me, Ziba. For your servant said to him, saddle a donkey for me, that I may ride upon it and go with the king. Remember, originally David was leaving on foot. He only started going on a donkey, presumably when Ziba brought him the donkeys. And that was part of what brought him favor. Well, why can't Mephibosheth go on foot? Because he's lame and crippled. So he tells Ziba, saddle me a donkey, and Ziba takes advantage of the situation and says, oh, wait a minute. If I just take the donkey myself, he's not going to be able to keep up, right? For your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant, Ziba, has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good. Angel means messenger, right? Okay, he's not saying literal angel, right? He's saying you're the messenger of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king? So he's expressing his fealty and loyalty. And the king said to him, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided, you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. So this is, kind of interesting, right? Again, David's solution is to split the land. Doesn't really seem like the fair thing to do. I mean, shouldn't he, like Ziba is the real traitor, we find out, okay? But Mephibosheth, in an act of even greater devotion, says he doesn't really care about the land. What does he care about? That David is okay. And he's like, I'm at your table anyway, right? I'm provided for like one of your sons. I don't need the land. It doesn't mean anything to me. You are what matter to me. So anyway, Mephibosheth kind of even though it doesn't really seem very fair on David's part, like Mephibosheth actually like displays his loyalty. Maybe what David is saying, in fairness to David, maybe what David is saying, like, okay, this is kind of a he said, just split the land. Like, I'm tired of giving it back and forth. But what that does elicit is like Mephibosheth actually proves in the end that he's the devoted one, because it's like, actually, no, really, I don't care about the land. I care about you being back, and you're like a father to me, right? So there's kind of a happy ending there, right? Okay, so we got kind of the the traitor, the kind of ambiguous case. Now David is gonna deal with those who are extremely loyal to him and reward them. Now Barzillai, the Gileadite, had come down from Rogelim. His name was mentioned very briefly, but now we're going to see, like, that he went with David and he was loyal to him. Now David's going to reward him. And he went on with the king to the Jordan to escort him over the Jordan. Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old, and he had provided the king with food while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. So, he was a benefactor of David in this sojourn apart from his kingdom, right? And apart from Jerusalem. And the king said to Barzillai, "Come over with me, and I'll provide for you with me in Jerusalem." But Barzillai said to the king, "How many years have I still to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old. Can I discern what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats or what he drinks? Can I still listen to the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way over the Jordan with the king. Why should the king recompense me with such a reward? Please let your servant return, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. But here is your servant Chimham. Let him go over with my lord the king, and do for him whatever seems good to you." And the king answered, "Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do for him whatever seems good to you. And all that you desire of me I will do for you." Then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king went over, and the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own home. Then the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went with him. All the people of Judah and also half the sons of Israel brought the king on his way. Notice all the people of Judah and half of Israel, right? So again, there's that tension in the background of like who's supporting the king. Okay. So Barzillai was wealthy but old benefactor of Jesus who aided him. Rogelim is about 50 miles north of the Jordan crossing near Jericho. So we're talking like this area up here. Okay. So he basically says, I just want to go home, right? Like, I appreciate the offer, but I can't really enjoy court anyway. Now maybe there's also a theological point here too, right? That he's recognized like all the luxuries of the royal court like don't really mean anything to him anymore, right? What really he's served his life as a soldier and as a warrior and as a leader, right? He's like, I just want to go home and be with my family and die, right? So there's there's probably, I think there's also some of that going on here. And then Chimham is a kinsman of Barzillai, probably his son. So he says, like, my son can go into your service, more or less, and you can give him the reward that you would have given me. Right? Okay. So we kind of like, it's a reversal of what David, as he was going out, we heard about, people's different reactions to him. As he's coming back in, David deals with those different situations, and as kind of partly as a kind of representative of all the different groups that he must have been dealing, and all the different people who had to take sides during the Civil War. And in general, right, David is like, hey, like, I'm about peace, right? I don't want more violence than we've already had. Okay, but there's still tension. 41. Then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, "Why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan and all David's men with him?" All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "Because the king is near of kin to us. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift?" And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, and in David also we have more than you. Why then did you despise us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So remember, again, this is why those little dialogues are in there, okay? So the men of Israel, again, meaning 10 northern tribes, were talking about bringing him back and reestablishing him as king, but they were a little hesitant. The men of Judah, right, they actually go get him, and so the men of Israel are upset because they're like, hey, you guys you're going to get favors, right? You know, do you think you're special just because the king, you know, we have 10 shares in him, meaning he's our king, you know, and we have 10 parts of him and you only have 2, right? You know, again, favoritism, right? It's politics. Like, you know, if we were to be like, hey, like, you know, it's not fair if the federal government is giving more money to states on the East Coast. Like, just because you're on the East Coast doesn't mean like you're president of the East Coast. You're president of the whole country, right? You know, that kind of thing, right? Is what's going on here. And again, this is both like tension during the reign of David is still there, but it's that preview of what's going to happen in David's grandson. Okay. And it actually sparks a little rebellion. So we get to chapter 20. Now, there happened to be a worthless fellow, which is not a very flattering epithet, right, for someone in the Bible. Basically, this guy, Sheba, worthless fellow just means he's a troublemaker, rabble rouser, right? Not a very principled man, just like wants to make trouble. Okay? There happened to be a very worthless fellow whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So again, here we have, like, again, you know, the whole book started, our whole study, how many weeks ago, started with the death of Saul. But we're still have, like, lingering, you know, Saulites, right? Guys who are loyal to Saul. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. And David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 concubines whom he had left to care for the house, and put them in a house under guard, and provided for them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood. So yeah, David, when David's crossing the Jordan, he's at Gilgal, he's getting close to Jerusalem. Sheba takes advantage of the fact that the king is still vulnerable and tries to, but also, by the way, where is he traveling through? The land of Benjamin, okay? Sheba tries to take advantage of this tension, have this rebellion so we can get him. David gets to Jerusalem, and then we do have this aside, you know, David's credit. The first thing that he does is he cares for his concubines who were raped and defiled incestuously by Absalom. Okay, we remember that from last week. So part of it is like what's going on here. He basically, in our terms, he gives them a nice retirement plan. Right? They can't be a part of his household anymore for a few reasons. Okay, I mean, there's the incestuous problem, right? But also, it's like, yeah, they can't be part of his household. They can't be, because, you know, and this is probably something worth spending a minute on, right? That, like, again, while concubinage is certainly not something that we practice or endorse at all today, there's all kinds of problems with it. Part of it in this day and age is like, if you're a concubine, if you're part of the king's household, you have a role in the household and you're provided for, right? And so, like, you have a place, you know, you have a job, right? And, like, you know, so they can't be part of the household anymore. It's not appropriate anymore. They've been defiled. Okay. And David recognizes that, like, that was not his intention, right? He did not leave them behind thinking that his son would do what he did to them. However, this whole time we've seen David recognizes all of this stems from my sin and my bad kingship, my bad fatherhood, right? So he does feel responsible for them, because he is responsible for them, right? And what happened to them, even though he didn't plan for that to happen, and he can't. So they can't live in his household anymore. So what does he do? He provides for them. He gives them a place where they can live and be provided for. They're no longer in his household, but they're not destitute on the street, right? because the reality is too is that in this time, right, to be a widow or to be an orphan, right, or to be a woman who was not in a household with her father, her son, or her husband, is basically, you can just read poverty, right? So in destitution. So in the Bible, when you hear, like, God says a lot, like, take care of orphans and widows, it's just like, it's a placeholder for, like, take care of the poor, right? Because to be an orphan or a widow means you're poor. So these concubines, notice, that it says they lived as if they were in widowhood, but they were provided for, right? So David takes care of them, but they can't be a part of his household anymore. So again, I do think there's signs of, like, real moral progress here on David, that he's like, I'm going to take care of them, right? I'm not just going to, they can't be my concubines anymore, for obvious reasons, right? Yeah, but however, it's still sad, right? They're living as if they're in widowhood, which is still in the Bible is, and in our day too, is a a difficult condition, right? In the Bible, lack of sexual union between couples who are married, I guess they're sort of married, childlessness, infertility, widowhood, they're all signs of consequences of moral failure, right? Because what's one of the greatest signs of God's blessing? Family, fertility, right? That kind of stuff. So here we kind of have, like, yeah, it's a sad situation, but it's what had to happen, right? Okay, so then we're gonna deal with David's new commander nephew, Amasa. Then the king said to Amasa, "Call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself." So David's like, okay, we got this guy Sheba is trying to rebel against us. So Amasa, you're my new guy in charge. Partly to stick it to Joab, partly because I'm trying to reunite the tribe of Judah around me. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the time set which had been appointed him. So either due to incompetence or questionable loyalty, right, Amasa is delayed in getting the army and getting the troops together, right? And again, troops in this time is like the militia, right? The able-bodied men of the tribe who can fight, right? Well, he delays. So who knows? Either he's incompetent or disloyal, and either way, not good. And David says to Abishai, so David's like, I have to go back to the sons of Zeruiah, right? Like, I have to go back to Abishai. He doesn't go back to Joab. He says to Abishai, his brother, now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do more harm than Absalom. Why? I don't know exactly why David says this. Maybe he's still like, my son Absalom. But I think probably part of what he's saying here, right, is like, he's gonna take no prisoners here, right? We need to deal with this. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself fortified cities and cause us trouble. And there went out after Abishai Joab, right? So Abishai's in charge now, but Joab, is like, I'm coming along. And the Cherethites and Pelethites, these are the royal mercenary bodyguards, and all the mighty men, and they went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. When they came at the great stone which is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. It's interesting because Gibeon, you remember, this is jog your memory a little bit, a long time ago, when they had that skirmish with Abner, one of the generals of the Saulites, right? That was in Gibeon. They were around the lake, and they like went 12 on 12, and it turned out all 24 died. You remember that story? It was a little while ago, but so we're kind of having a David versus Saul again, repeating itself. David's house versus Saul's house. When they came to the great stone which is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened upon his loins. And as he went forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" Because they are cousins, remember. And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword which was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him with it in the body and shed his bowels to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. So Joab, again, this is like, 4 or 5 different murders that he's been involved with, right? He murders his cousin, right? what's the importance with the right hand? Usually your sword is in your right hand. Most people are left-handed or right-handed, right? So he takes out his, at least from what I think is happening here, he takes out his right hand and he puts his right hand near his face to, like, as if a sign of affection, to kiss him, right? Notice too, how was our Lord betrayed, right? A kiss. Not saying that Amasa is necessarily a Christ figure here, but like still, he takes his right hand, and so Amasa's thinking, I'm safe. He doesn't have a sword. He's not on guard, right? And lo and behold, there's a sword that he kind of happened to let down on the ground. He picks it up, and while he's bringing it, stabs it, right? And again, this is all in the midst of this fog of this rebellion, so Joab can get away with it, right? So with this, he removes his last rival, and he remains. I don't know if it said. Well, here it will say that he's. Yeah, let's just keep going. Then Joab and Abishai his brother pursued Sheba the son of Bichri, and one of Joab's men took his stand by Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." Again, Joab, charismatic military leader, and in the chaos of it, they're like, "Hey, he's going to lead us to victory. We're going to go with it. We're going to go with him again." And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the highway. It's kind of horrible image, right? And anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the man saw that all the people stopped, he carried Amasa out of the highway into the field and threw a garment over him. When he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. So Joab removes his last rival, and he remains David's commander until David's death, despite the king's dislike for him. Why? He's effective. Even here, right? He stabs his incompetent and or disloyal rival. We're not really sure, right? And he's charismatic. You want, when you're, I can only imagine when you're in the middle of a battle, right? Especially the types of battles that they fought in this time, very hand to hand, right? Is like you want to follow the guy that you think you're going to get out alive with. And that happened a lot with Joab. So they follow him. And so even though David tried, we've seen, tried to remove him from office, he couldn't get rid of him, right? Without, losing the loyalty of the military and others. And also Joab helped him win a lot of victories. So, and Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth Maacah, and all the Bichrites assembled and followed him in. This town, Abel of Beth Maacah, is in the far north, 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It's not on this map, but so we're talking like up here, okay, somewhere in there. So he has fled from. Remember, David was crossing over here. Sheba got everybody excited, whatever, and he's been fleeing north. And then he does get a fortified city, right? Or that was the concern. What's the problem with that? Once you get into a fortified city, now we're in a prolonged conflict again, right? Because cities are hard to get armies out of it, or people, when you're fighting them in this time period. Okay, so now he's way up north, being pursued by Joab and Abishai and David's mighty men. And all the men who were with Joab came and besieged him in Abel of Beth Maacah, and they cast up a mound against the city, and it stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall to throw it down. Then a wise woman called from the city, "Hear, hear, tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you." And he came near her, and the woman said, "Are you Joab?" He answered, "I am." Remember Joab, he dealt with the wise woman of Tekoa when he was trying to get David to, bring back Absalom. Again, there's a motif here. David talking to another woman, right? Who, as I mentioned this last week, most of the protagonists in this book are male. However, there are some really key moments in the story when a female comes in and in a subtle but very significant way changes the trajectory of the story, right? And that happens here too. Although it's a little brutal here. But then she said to him, "Listen to the words of your maidservant." And he answered, "I am listening." Then she said, "They were wont to say in old time, 'Let them but ask counsel at Abel.' And so they settled a matter. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city which is a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? Right, sieging is very brutal practice, right? Because both for the besieging army and for those in the city, right? Because it's protracted conflict. It's just not. And this is the city that Sheba was able to capture and get inside of, and so then this woman is representative of them, innocent people who didn't want to have anything to do with this conflict, right? Okay. Joab answered, verse 20, far be it from me, far be it, that I should swallow up or destroy, which is kind of ironic for him to say, right? That is not true. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim, called Sheba, the son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against King David. Give him up him alone, and I will withdraw from the city. Notice there's also been a motif here of and this is common, not just here in this time in history, but in general, you strike the shepherd and the sheep scatter. He's like, hey, we're just after this one guy, Sheba. Like, if we can get him, that's who we're really after. David's enemies said that about David, right? Multiple times. They tried to get David, and they're like, And the woman said to Joab, behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall. All right. I told you this one was a little more brutal, right? Then the woman went to all the people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it out to Joab. So basically, the people of the town, she's like, hey, guess what? All they really want is this guy dead. And they're like, all right. So they cut off his head, and they threw it out to Joab. So he blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his home. And Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. Now Joab was in command of all the army of Israel, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was in command of the Cherethites and the Pelethites. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Benaiah is going to be the commander of Solomon's army, okay, eventually. And Adoram was in charge of the forced labor, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder, and Sheva the secretary, and Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jairite was also David's priest. I don't know if you remember, I think this was chapter 8. You remember we got a list of like David's cabinet. We're getting this again, and this is the end of the chronological narrative of the book, right? There's a few kind of things. Well, first of all, okay, I will tell you, like I said, I'll tell you a few things about. Well, here I'll tell you about this list, and then I'll tell you a little bit about First Kings. We're not going to go into it, but you can read more. The narrative picks up First Kings 1, okay, more or less. So Benaiah, Solomon's future commander, he's in charge of the royal mercenary bodyguard. He's mentioned here. It's notable that here David's sons are not mentioned as holding leadership positions like they were, partly because a lot of them it's not ended so well, but also maybe it's showing, the chaos in David's household, or maybe they're like, well, we need to get some other people in here, and also there's a new position that's been created to oversee forced labor, those who work on state labor projects, and probably made up of those who are most disloyal, right? Like war criminals, basically, right? And what are they going to do? State building projects. What's going to be a state building project that's going to come up pretty soon? Not in David's time, but in Solomon's time is the temple, right? Yeah. So we're going towards the temple. So interesting, right? That if you have forced labor, right? It's it's been a civil war, right? And just like with our country, the period of reconstruction, right? It's you got some things you got to figure out. How are we going to move forward? And that's part of what's going on there. Okay, so this is the end of the chronological narrative. It's picked up again as First Kings. Just a couple notes, okay? In First Kings, David's fourth son, Adonijah, he will he will say, hey, I'm next in line. He will attempt to take the throne while his father is on his deathbed. First Kings basically starts with David. He's dying / on his deathbed. And Adonijah does a kind of Absalom-like move where he says, hey, everybody, I'm be the new king. Bathsheba goes to David and says, hey, did you make Adonijah king? And David's like, no. And she's like, what about the oath you made to me, which is not recorded, but apparently she made an oath, or he made an oath to her, that Solomon will be the next king. David had other sons, okay, between Adonijah and Solomon. However, for whatever reason, they weren't in contention for the throne. Maybe partly, you get far enough down the list and it's like they never expected to be in the running, right? But Solomon, and this is, it's interesting, right? That, it says Solomon was favored by the Lord. Also, Bathsheba, and you see this in the first few chapters of First Kings, she's pretty aggressive, with getting her son as king. She is definitely not a passive figure. If you think she was, and maybe she was in 2 Samuel, but but part of it is because, like, for her, it's kind of a matter of life and death, right? Because and I know I've talked about this a little bit in the subsequent Davidic kingdom. Who becomes the most important woman in the kingdom? Who becomes the queen? It's the mother of the king, and she actually has a title, Gabira, the queen mother. Because and this was not completely unique to Israel. It was, ancient Near East culture of the time. When the king has a harem, right? When he has multiple wives and concubines, how do you choose between one of them to be the queen, right? You're just asking for trouble there, right? But there's only one mother of the king, and so she becomes the queen, and she actually has a royal position. There's a scene where Solomon, later when he's king, when Bathsheba, well, actually, no, that's part of the story. Part of Adonijah's attempt to take over the kingdom is, well, I don't know. Sorry. I don't know how far. I feel like I have to keep explaining things to explain things. There's a woman who's a part of David's harem who, in the first part of Kings, it's made very clear that David, because of his age, is not able to sleep with her, okay? And that's important because, again, it sounds kind of weird to us, but it's like, if the king is impotent, not good, right? Like, that means he can't protect us when, we, it's a sign of, he's not fit to rule, Not saying we should have tried this with Biden, but, like, maybe it would have, maybe it would have been a test, Anyway, sorry, probably shouldn't have said that. But anyway, like you could see, right? He's not able, he's impotent. So, so it's very emphasized in the text, like, yep, she was very beautiful young woman, right? Part of the harem, remained a virgin. Adonijah goes to Bathsheba and says to Solomon, this is, says to him, hey, can you give me this woman to be my wife? Bathsheba goes to her son and intercedes for Adonijah, or so it seems. And as soon as Solomon, I don't know if, and it's not really sure if his mother was like, hint, hint, right? But as soon as Solomon hears that Adonijah wants to wed this particular concubine of their father, who's still able to get married because he didn't actually sleep with her, so it's not incest, right? Solomon says, is like, I'm taking this guy out, and has him executed. Why? Because, again, remember, the king who succeeds the king, the guy who takes over, he got, the harem, right? So it's an act of usurpation. It's subtle, but it's an act, Adonijah is saying, hey, I want this woman because she was part of David's royal harem, aka I'm the successor, right? And that's what leads to Adonijah's death, okay? So we got all this going back and forth. Well, what happens in the first few chapters of Kings to establish the successor, different characters take sides between Adonijah and Solomon, and whichever side you took ends up deciding your fate, right? Well, I mean, not really, but like, again, it's told in the context of like God's providence, and we're reading it obviously in hindsight. So guess who supports who supports Adonijah? Joab supports Adonijah. He chooses wrong, right? And eventually, Benaniah, who had a role as the captain of the royal bodyguard, he murders Joab in very much in a similar manner. So Joab gets what was coming to him. Benaniah supports Solomon. Joab supports Adonijah. Chose the wrong side. Also, interestingly, the two priests who were faithful to David, Zadok and Abiathar. Abiathar chooses Adonijah. Zadok gives his loyalty to Solomon. Abiathar ends up meeting his demise, right? Like again, like, and this was the politics of the time, right? It was like Game of Thrones, right? I mean, it was succession was a big deal, and it wasn't so straightforward, right? It's just because the king had real power and had real they weren't constitutional monarchs who acted as figureheads, right? The king and what he decided was really important. So anyway, so it's just to kind of tie up some loose ends, right? There's more to the story. You can read about it in the first few chapters of Kings, but the first few chapters, based on this Game of Thrones, right? Solomon ends up becoming the king, undisputed king. Adonijah is killed, is executed by Solomon. David, on his deathbed, says to Solomon, gives him advice, and gives a list of people like, hey, watch out for him, trust him, look out for him, right? And Solomon acts accordingly, so that he's reigning in his reign. He's the undisputed king of United Israel, and then that's what the next few chapters of Kings goes on to talk about his rule. Anyway, so you do kind of, so in order to, I just want to kind of tie up some of those loose ends, right? Because it doesn't finish here. Okay, all right. So yeah, you can read more about that in First Kings, but it's kind of fascinating, right? Just like, yeah, how it all goes down. All right. So we're at these final 4 chapters. Okay. I'll put it here. So these final 4 chapters are an appendix, okay, or what we call an appendix, okay. As I said, they aren't chronological. These events take place at various times in David's life, but they pretty much, most of them, well, not all of them, but most of them seem to take place kind of during this period before his transgression with Bathsheba, and somewhere in between when he's rising to power. Okay, that's where most of these seem to take place. Okay, it's not unusual for literature of this time to have things put on the end, appendixes, right? Things appended onto the end, right? Again, what part of it's practical, right? It's not like in this time period, you can just go back to your Word document and cut and be like, all right, let's put this story where it actually took place, right? No, once you've started writing out the scroll or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, I should add that, or here's, so whatever the sources of these appendix, the person who compiled Samuel as we have it today thought that these were important stories to include. Why? Well, that's kind of open to speculation. Well, there's some open to speculation, but there are like some points here. I think part of it is like we're kind of, well, I'll explain the structure of it, and then that'll kind of explain like what the lesson is or what the point is. So these last 4 chapters have what's called a chiastic structure. So a chiastic structure is something where you have a series of, and these can be in things as small as a sentence or as big as narratives. But a chiastic structure is something where you have a series of events or words or phrases or concepts, and then you walk backwards in kind of a parallel or contrasting in dealing with those things, on the way back. So a good example, we just went through one. David out of Jerusalem up the Mount of Olives, he first deals with the loyal men, then he deals with Ziba, Mephibosheth, then he deals with Shimei, right? On the way back, he deals with them in reverse order. Did you notice? Did you pick that up, right? So he deals with Shimei, right? And I'll put a little asterisk here, right? Because it's not the same, right? It's parallel. What's he doing? He's dealing with them as the king coming back, right? Then he deals with the Ziba Mephibosheth incident, right? Then he deals with the loyalists. So this structure is called a chiastic structure, where you have a series of events, and again, you could actually do this in poetry, right? Where like you have a line, like rhyming lines, or I was looking up different examples of this. Like I don't remember off the top of my head, but like Shakespeare had a line where he says like one word, then another word, then he says that second word with a synonym, and then he says the first word with a synonym, right? So anyway, it's where you deal with something in some kind of sequential order, and then you walk it back and reverse it. Okay, so the way that you could, again, and this is getting like more technical, but it's a way to help visualize it, is if you call this like this part of the story A, and then B, and then C, then you've got C prime, B prime, A prime, right? Again, parallel, okay. And sometimes, sometimes it's an odd number, and you might have D in here, and D is the middle, and it's not part of A, B, C, right? And so yeah, in the Bible, and not just in the Bible, but in the Bible, these kind of chiastic structures are all over. Okay. By the way, the reason why it's called chiastic is because it's from the Greek word chi, which looks like X. Okay. And it's because if you read it from left to right, if you go A, B, B prime, A prime, it forms an X. So it's chiastic X structure. Okay. And these can be much longer, right? You see the general pattern, right? But so now when it comes to chiastic structures, and then authors and redactors and stuff, they can play with these. I think part of the reason why these are common in ancient literature is because they serve as mnemonic devices, right? If you remember, if you are trying to remember something, you kind of walk it one way and then you walk it back, right? Also, too, again, it also fits the narrative here, right? That in this example that we read, a few chapters ago, David deals with the loyal people, the kind of fuzzy situation, the traitor, and then coming back, he deals with them in reverse order, which makes sense, right? So authors can play with this, right? And there's all kinds of reasons, but these are everywhere in the Bible. If you look them up, you'll find them everywhere. If you start looking for them, you'll find them everywhere. In the Psalms, right? In the Psalms, a lot of times they'll have chiastic structure. I think in Matthew's Gospel, it might even be the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know. I have to check that. Right? Like the different sections of it are this structure. Okay. In fact, yeah, I'm pretty sure the Sermon on the Mount. I'd have to. I'm jogging my memory a little bit, but I'm pretty sure the Sermon on the Mount is written in a chiastic structure where Jesus deals with something, and then in the back he's dealing with those themes. Well, okay. With all that said, in a chiastic structure in the Bible, almost always, I don't want to say always, because authors will play with this, but almost always, the most important part of the chiastic structure is the middle. If it's even, it's these two things, right? If it's odd, it'd be, in this case, D. That's all you really need to know for now, okay? The most important thing of the chiasm is the middle. The other things, almost always, the other things kind of layer like an onion around the middle, the core, and that's what the main message is, okay? So with all that said, these last 4 chapters are a chiasm. So what do we have here? We have what I'll call A. We have a plague, okay? Then we have B, we have a list of warriors and their deeds. Then we have C, we have a Song of David, also called a psalm. Then C, then that's the first part of the chiasm. Then we will walk it back. C prime, we have another Song of David. Well, and I'll call it something different just so that we, it's, they're called the last words of David. Then we have B prime, we have another list of warriors. And then in A prime, we have another plague. So, based on what I just told you, what's the most important part of this appendix? The Psalms, right? Yeah. The other stories are framing devices for the Psalms. And like, why did the author put this in here? It seems to be a kind of, maybe like a summary of David's legacy, right? And there's a lot of theological things that I'll try to pull out of this for you, okay? But the thing we're going to read, and these plague stories in particular are really bizarre, but they're the frame for these Psalms, okay? And that's the most important part. It's almost kind of like, to think about it, like, here's the frame, and these two Psalms are like the great lessons of David's life, right? Where he kind of sums up in psalm form what he's learned, okay, is one way you could think about it, okay? All right, well, let's just dive into it, and then, you'll see. By the way, it doesn't correspond directly with, obviously there's 6 elements here, so there's, a couple of them that take up whole chapters, and some that are, but remember, the chapters and verses are artificial in the sense that they were added by monks later in the medieval period. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just, you don't want to get hung up on that too much. Okay, first story, the plague, okay, this first plague. And remember, we're in a whole new literary genre here. We're not, it's not continuing the story that we just had from chapter 20. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord. So again, we're in his, remember, when he was in his earlier days, he was really good about, seeking the face of the Lord. And the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, Gibeon is about 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem. In fact, it's on this map right here, okay, in the land of Benjamin. The Gibeonites were a tribe occupying the land of Canaan that saw Joshua ransacking through Canaan and sued for peace, basically. And we're like, hey, we see that your God is the best God. Please be peaceful with us. And Joshua swears an oath with them for peace, right? This is in Joshua chapter 9. So this is a few hundred years before the events of Saul and David, right? Well, at some point, and this is not in the Samuel literature, interestingly enough, it's not in Samuel 1. At some point, apparently, Saul had ordered for a massacre of the Gibeonites, okay, which out of justice brought a curse upon the land that bled into David's reign. And so David had to deal with this for some reason. Because that's what God says. There's blood guilt on Saul and his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites, whoever's, the representatives who were left. Now the Gibeonites were not the sons of Israel, but a remnant of the Amorites. Although the sons of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to slay them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So it's misplaced zeal here, right? And a kind of misplaced, like, hey, how can I rally the people of Israel and Judah? Hey, let's go after the Gibeonites. Well, wrong people to go after, because Joshua made a oath with them, right? When they first entered this land. So not good. And David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And how shall I make expiation, that you may bless the heritage of Israel? So David is seeking to make expiation or atonement, right, because of the injustice. And how shall I make that you may bless the heritage of the Lord? What's the heritage of the Lord? Israel, right? So, like, how can you be in right relations with us again? The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And David said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place at all in the territory of Israel. Let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them up before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." So they ask for a 7. Obviously doesn't correspond to the number of men that the Gibeonites lost, but it's a symbolic number, right? And it's from the house of Saul, right? So they asked for them to be publicly hanged before the Lord. Partly why it's said before the Lord, because guess where the tabernacle was at this point in the story? Gibeon, right? It hadn't come to Jerusalem yet. Okay, so and it's also possible. This is a little bit speculative, but this public display, right, of this whatever this hanging consisted of. There's some scholars who actually think it was akin to a kind of crucifixion, right? So, because what's going on here is not just an execution, but these sons of Saul are going to be hung and exposed to the elements as a shameful death because of this crime of Saul. Okay, and David says, okay. Verse 7, but the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord, which was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So David's like, well, I swore an oath to Jonathan, right? We've seen that multiple times. He's gone out of his way to protect Mephibosheth, okay, because of his oath to Jonathan. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul. Rizpah is one of Saul's concubines. Armoni and Mephibosheth, not the same Mephibosheth. The would have been a nephew of Mephibosheth, the other Mephibosheth. Okay, they reuse names like we do. And the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mehothalite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord. And the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of the harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. So Saul doesn't have apparently enough sons, so David takes 2 of his sons and 5 of his grandsons, and they are offered as a sacrifice. Okay, it's interesting. The narrative, and again, this narrative is strange. Okay, admittedly, it is strange. It seems like, well, first of all, it's during the barley harvest, which is in the spring, around March and April. And it's almost like, their blood is being offered to fecund the land, right? That's the problem, right? They're in not, I guess it says it's a famine, right? I put plague. I mean, not same thing, but plague, famine, a catastrophe. I guess a famine is a kind of plague, depending on how you use the word. So again, we're in a famine, right? And it's like, but like a lot of this is a very, at best, primitive understanding of God. In fact, it's a very pagan understanding of God, right? It's very much like the kind of understanding of God of a lot of Israel's neighbors, right? That like we need to appease the deity in this way. It's also interesting, the narrative really doesn't comment on the guilt or innocence of these particular figures. So I don't think we should necessarily assume that they're totally innocent. I mean, as we've seen, like David and his, governance and his military conquests are very much a family affair, right? So it's possible these guys were involved in the, massacre of the Gibeonites. So I don't know that it's necessarily appropriate to say that they just must be innocent victims. Okay, it doesn't really comment on that. But the thing that's kind of bizarre about this, right, is it's a very pagan understanding of God. A very much a tit for tat, transactional kind of understanding of God, which is not really what God is about. in as he's trying to help Israel learn what he's really about. Okay, so what ends up happening then? Rizpah, the daughter of Ahiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. So what does the Saul's concubine do, right? The mother, and I guess it would have been her nephews or grandnephews. I'm not really sure, whatever. She, because this is supposed to be not just an execution but a public display, they're exposed to the elements. And in this time period, right, most shameful thing you could do is to have an exposed, unburied person. She covers them and doesn't let the birds get on them and doesn't let thieves come and desecrate their bodies, right? She has this kind of constant vigil for them, right, which wouldn't have been very easy. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Ahiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul on Gilboa. And he brought them up from there, the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all that the king commanded. And after that, God heeded supplications for the land. So Rizpah's maternal compassion moves David to give them an honorable burial. Okay, so again, we don't know. It's not really commenting. And again, certain details that we're interested in are not in here, right? And it's not the point of the story, apparently. It's not really commenting on their guilt or innocence. It kind of seems like these guys got what was coming to them, right? But David gives them a proper burial. However, again, this is a very pagan way of understanding God's justice, right? God has been trying since the law of Moses to kind of wean people off of this kind of way of treating him. But, it does still make sense that, like, even in the time of David, there's still this very kind of primitive understanding of God, right? Because again, how do pagans worship, right? They are trying to appease God or the gods, right? Like, that's the whole thing, right? Like, we have no rain. Well, let's appeal to Baal, the storm god, offer him sacrifice. Obviously, he needs something from us, right? And God has been trying to wean them off. But here, it kind of makes it seem like that's what God is asking. Maybe it's just at this time, even David is still like trying to learn how God operates. I don't know, right? It's kind of strange. But here's, I think, maybe the reason why it's in here, or at least one of the reasons. Okay. Note that this is a sacrifice of human blood to restore peace, right? And it might even, if scholars are correct, it might even be a kind of crucifixion to do so, right? It's even if it's ultimately temporary, okay? So again, this whole episode seems very theologically naive and underdeveloped, at least how God has been trying to bring people along. But maybe part of it is like David still has much to learn. Okay. All right, let's keep going on. Okay. So that's A, bizarre story. Okay. B, the Philistines had war again with Israel. And again, this is not later chronologically. We're back to the time when he was warring with them in chapters 1 through 8. And David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary. That's interesting. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, note the Philistines had some giants like Goliath, right? Like large men, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. So this giant wants to kill David. That sounds kind of familiar, right? By the way, I wrote 300 shekels is over 7 pounds. So this guy's got a huge sword, right? Okay. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to David's aid, and attacked the Philistine and killed him. So he's acting like his uncle here, right? David killed Goliath. Then David's men adjured him, "You shall no more go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." Who's the lamp of Israel? David, right? He's their, what are they saying? He's your hope. And so it's interesting. We have this episode here. At some point, David is no longer the youthful military man. Physically, he's not able to do what he could do earlier in his career, right? Oops, I lost my. Oh, there we go. So this episode, like, there's something here about, like, it represents at least David's decline in physical ability, military prowess. Okay. So at some point in his career, right, and this episode is emblematic of it, David was not able to fight like he once was. Okay. He's humbled, right? I mean, think about how humbling that would have been for him, the mighty warrior king, to be like, I can't do this anymore, right? I need my nephew because I don't have the physical prowess anymore. Yet at the same time, we who know the story also know that this, this might have been this is during the time period somewhere in here where he started to stay back more. Not because he was cowardly, but because he physically couldn't do it anymore. Well, that also in the back of our minds too should think like, well, this kind of decline of David and staying away from the battle is a large part of what leads to the Bathsheba incident, right? Bathsheba Gate. I've never heard that. Maybe I don't know if that's a real thing, that's a term, but so anyway, kind of, here, but so here we have, like, yeah, it's a list of David's mighty men, but we also have, David is being humbled here, right? Again, David has much to learn, right? He can't put all of his stock in his military prowess, right? It's not just him, right? Being the biggest, baddest warrior around who killed Goliath, okay, the war hero. After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Shebeki the Hushathite slew Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jeharethgim, the Bethlehemite from Bethlehem, slew Goliath the Gittite, which is, so this, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. It's actually one of the more puzzling things in Samuel literature. It was very clearly earlier in the book, David killed Goliath. Chronicles says that Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. So maybe it's a, he was, the transcriber got confused. We're not really sure, to be honest. We don't really know what's going on. But and there was again war at Gath, which is in Philistia, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he was also descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, slew him. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Okay, so that's Unit B, the list of warriors, but this notable episode about, David. It's notable that David is in physical decline, right? He can't be on the front lines anymore. He's not the mighty warrior king of 1 Samuel. All right, now we get to C, okay? And we have what's titled in my version, David's Song of Thanksgiving, chapter 22. This psalm, closely resembles Psalm 18. In fact, it's probably, almost certainly, based on people who study this kind of stuff, an earlier version of Psalm 18. Psalm 18 is a more, like, language-wise refined version, but the themes and the language are the same. It's more likely, it's likely that this version of Psalm 18, it goes back like is from David himself, okay, and it's because it's older. And what's the theme? Salvation and strength belong to Yahweh. So I'll read it for you, and then we'll see that. Okay, I'm kind of running out of space here, but so salvation and strength belong to Yahweh. Well, that's a pretty good lesson to learn, right? Again, and David has, earned his stripes, right? He's learned this the hard way, all right? All right. I'll read it, but chronologically, this seems to be placed after he subjugated the surrounding nations, or at least Saul, and he's somewhat secure in his position as king of Israel. but before his adultery with Bathsheba. He hasn't been impacted by that yet. Okay. All right. So, and David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies." As I'm reading this, think about like all we know about David now, but also like especially up to this point in his life, he's been running from Saul. He's been in a lot of battles. He's been a lot of right, and this is kind of his this is his take from it, right? And who's his rock? God. Obviously a metaphor, right? But a powerful one. For the waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of perdition assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the underworld. So like, and has David encountered the underworld, right? The like face to face with death? Absolutely, right? He's been fleeing. Up until this point in his life, he's been fleeing from Saul, right? Running for his life. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I called. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. The temple doesn't exist yet. What is he talking about? The real temple where God lives, that the temple on earth is just a shadow of, right? Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew as he had seen upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him, his canopy, thick clouds, a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him, the coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. Very, poetic imagery. He's not saying that like nature is God, but rather nature is the servant of God, right? As God wants, like so it is, right? And all these manifestations of God's glory, right, taking place here. He reached from on high. He took me. He drew me out of the many waters. The waters is a symbol of death, right? By the way, Israel were not a naval people. They were terrified of water, right? Because it's like, you go so far out into the water, you're not coming back, right? So if they had to go into the water, like the Mediterranean Sea, they stayed close to the shore, right? They were not a seafaring people. So water, while a symbol of life, is also a symbol of death. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They came upon me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God, unlike Saul. I added that, but for all his ordinances were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. Therefore the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. I'll stop and note, right? Like notice, like, David's not wrong, right? But this is also pre-Bathsheba, right? So he's not wrong, right? But he's a little bit naive. I mean, again, he is righteous, but we're going to see here in a second he has a rounding out perspective in C prime. Okay. With the loyal you show yourself loyal. With the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the pure you show yourself pure, and with the crooked you show yourself perverse. You deliver a humble people, but your eyes are upon the haughty to bring them down. Yes, you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. Yes, by you I can crush a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The promise of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. Again, I'm sure that David throughout his life, especially at this point in his life, is partly wondering, like, why me? Why not Saul? So he's not wrong here, right? But again, maybe he still has, he's going to get a different perspective, right? After he falls, right? For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge. He has made me my way safe. He has made my feet like deer's feet and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your help made me great. You gave me a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and did not turn back until they were consumed. I consumed them. I thrust them through so that they did not rise. They fell under my feet. For you girded me with strength for the battle. You made my assailants sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, those who hated me, and I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as dust to the earth. I crushed them and stamped them down like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with the peoples. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fastness. Notice, like David's recognizing, that like this isn't just about leading my people. Like, foreign nations are coming to serve God through me, right? Which is again that was God's promise to Abraham, right? That the nations will be blessed by, and David's seeing like, yeah, they're coming to me because of how the Lord has worked through me. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be my God, the rock of my salvation, the God who gave me vengeance and brought down peoples under me, who brought me out from my enemies. You exalted me above my adversaries. You delivered me from men of violence. For this I will extol you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. Great triumphs he gives to his king, and shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. Also, a little bit of that last line is not a throwaway line, right? It's like, that's seems to be pointing at the covenant, right? To David and his descendants forever. Okay. I mean, imagine David, he's the greatest warrior around, and he's also able to compose a song like that even we thousands of years later can see like how beautiful and how imaginative it is, right? And that's the beautiful thing about poetry, right? That expresses things in a way that prose has a harder time getting to, right? So and I would say like overall, like, what a guy, right? What a lesson to learn, right? Like, God, you're my strength, right? You're rewarding me because he's not giving himself credit. He's giving God the credit and recognizing like, I am what I am because of God, right? Salvation and strength belong to Yahweh, right? And am I blessed because of that? Absolutely, right? That's a great lesson. I mean, if you could, if I could teach that to my high school kids, right? Like, great, great, right? But again, like, you can kind of see hints, especially because we know the whole story. He's still a little young and a little naive, right? It's not bad, it's not wrong, but that's why we're going to get, okay, so that's the first part of the chiasm. Now we're going to get to C prime, okay? It's a much shorter poem, much shorter psalm, and it's called The Last Words of David, okay? So now, the last words of David, it does not mean his final words before death. These aren't his deathbed words. You have to look for in First Kings. He has his deathbed words, okay? It's his final composition as a poet or psalmist. It's his last psalm, okay? Moses and Jacob have similar kind of last words in Deuteronomy and Genesis. So David is in this kind of tradition of the patriarch giving his wisdom to his people, right, before he passes on. But don't think necessarily deathbed, just his last psalm. And so before, right, that his hymn of thanksgiving was like when he was at the seemingly height, right, before Bathsheba. Now he's in his last psalm, and all the rest of it has happened, right? And he's a pretty broken man in a lot of ways, right? And we saw, right, again, this is part of why the frame is important. We saw that physically he declined, but also, he had more than a bump in the road in terms of moral transgression. I mean, adultery, murder, but the way he handled his children, right? Like, again, the young person's optimism of like, who's converted to God and is like, yeah, if I do good, then I'll be rewarded. Like, because God's awesome, right? Which is good, a good place to start. But he has a much more, he just has a more old man's perspective now, right? He's not as young anymore. So he's giving his last words, okay, his last psalm. The Spirit of the Lord speaks. Oh, sorry, I gotta introduce it. Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who is raised on high, the anointed of the God of Israel, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me, his word is upon my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken, the rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth upon a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. Yes, does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But godless men are all like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be taken with the hand. But the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire. So I think, the first thing to notice is, this is a lot shorter, right? When you're young, right, he's kind of gushing over God, right? But he's a lot more terse here, right? And it's a poem of a righteous king who fears the Lord and lives by his statutes, and he's like, that's what you got to do, right? At the end of the day, you need to. It's not different than that lesson, but it's just a little like, yeah. At the end of the day, like, both because of what I know about myself and what I know about how the world works, is like, you got to trust the Lord. That's where you got to put your eggs in that basket, right? And the wicked will not prosper in the end, even though it gets rough at times, right? So I think, that basically, trust God. So maybe another way to think of like, what are the lessons, okay, is like, what are his lessons? Fear God, and trust God. And, he's lived through it, right? So he's saying that with not just like again, you've got kind of this like rounded out perspective, okay? Fear God, trust God. Oh, and thank God, right? Maybe that should be first, actually. I forgot the one. Yeah, thank God, fear God, trust God. Okay. And that's kind of like the lesson, right? And again, it's this frame of this chiasm, but also knowing the story, okay? And so I think the outer layers of the chiasm are kind of giving us the frame from which David like learned this lesson. And we who are seeing the chiasm but also know his story, we know this, because we know his story, right? We know that like David, this was a hard-earned lesson for him, right? It's not just the kind of more naive optimism of David the Conqueror, like that's part of it, but it's also not just desolation, right? At the end of his life. Anyway, that's so that like, yeah, thank God, fear God, trust God, or salvation and strength belong to Yahweh. Like that lesson, like that's the nugget, right? The other stuff is framework for it, where we see David kind of learning or needing to learn, right? And it frames that. So that's the important part. Okay. All right. So now B prime, we go to another list of warriors. Okay. These are the names of the mighty men. This is going to be tough. Whom David had. Josheba Habath, a Techmonite. He was chief of the three. He wielded his spear against 800, whom he slew at one time. And next to him among the three mighty men was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the son of Ahohai. He was with David when they defied the Philistines, who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel withdrew. He rose and struck down the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand clung to the sword. And the Lord wrought a great victory that day. And the men returned after him only to strip the slain. And next to him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Hariite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, and there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the men fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot and defended it, and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great victory. And 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came about harvest time to David at the cave of Adullam, when a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. And David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." Then the three mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took and brought it to David. But he would not drink of it. He poured it out to the Lord, and said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" Therefore he would not drink it. These things did the 3 mighty men. This little story is kind of odd. It's so 3 of David's most mighty men. He says kind of at a point in the war when the Philistines had Bethlehem and David was in Jerusalem, he said, "Man, I really wish for that great water from home," right? And they heard him, and either I guess they took him literally and were like, "All right, let's do it." And at the risk of their lives, they got him some water. They brought it to him. It seems to show the fierce loyalty of David and these men, right? They were willing to go to extraordinary lengths for him. And then, he dumps it as a sacrifice to the Lord. When I was reading about this, it was interesting that St. Gregory, who I think would have been less aware that this is probably not chronological, he saw a sign of moral progress in David here, that he who was tempted by Bathsheba and gave into his lusts is willing to deny his, bodily desires and say, I'm not going to take this drink of water, even though it's really good tasting water, right? As we live or we're dealing with a time here where good water is hard to come by, right? So anyway, yeah, kind of but he's making a sacrifice to the Lord of something that is very dear to him bodily, right? So St. Gregory's here you see some moral progress, right? Which is I don't how that fits in, I don't know, but it's kind of it's an interesting little vignette. Okay. Now Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of the 30, and he wielded his spear against 300 men and slew them, and won a name beside the 3. He was the most renowned of the 30 and became their commander, but he did not attain to the 3. And Benaniah, the future killer of Joab and commander of Solomon's army, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man of Kabazeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck 2 Ariols of Moab. He also went down and slew a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. And he slew an Egyptian, a handsome man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but Benaniah went down to him with a staff and snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and slew him with his own spear. These things did Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, and won a name beside the 3 mighty men. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3, and David set him over his bodyguard. Asahel, the brother of Joab, was one of the 30. Elhanan, the son of Dodo of Bethlehem, Shammah of Harod, Elika of Herod, Helez the Peltite, Ira, the son of Ikesh of Tekoa, Abiezer of Anathoth, Mabunai the Hushathite, Zalman the Ahothite, Mahariai of Netophah, Heleb the son of Banaah, the Netophah, Eti the son of Ribai of Gibeah of the Benjaminites, Benaniah of Pirathon, Hedai of the brooks of Gaash, Abialbon the Arabathite, Asmaveth of Bahurim, Eliahaba of Shalbon. Father Joseph Panessa is going to probably be so ashamed of me if he finds out of this video. The sons of Jashin, Jonathan, Shammah the Hararite, Ahihim the son of Sharar the Hararite, Eliphelet the son of Abishai of Mahakah, Eliam the son of Ahathophel of Gilo, Herzro of Carmel, Harai the Arbite, Igil the son of Nathan of Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Nahariah of Beeroth, the armor bearer of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, Uriah the Hittite. 37 in all. Notably, Uriah is, on the list, right? No, he's last, but certainly not least. Again, part of okay, why is this appendix on here? Well, partly because it's the author of, either these were written or oral traditions. The compiler, redactor of Samuel was this was the band, right? These were the guys, right? Just like how, if you're going back to, I don't know, you're yeah, in high school we had, Jim and Joe and Sally, and we were the gang, right? I don't know, similar kind of thing, right? So they're all mentioned. But yeah, it's interesting, right? That, last is, but certainly not least, is Uriah. Okay, last chapter, last story. All right, chapter 24. Again, bizarre story, but we have to remember it's part of this frame of the chiasm. Okay. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. We don't know why, by the way, in this episode. And he incited David against them, saying, "Go, number Israel and Judah." This is really fascinating because Chronicles says that it was not God who incited David to take a census. It was Satan. Well, what gives? Is it God or Satan? The answer is both. Okay. It's understood in the framework of Samuel, right, that we've been dealing with, that nothing happens without God's permissive will. Satan does not allow things, Satan is not allowed to do anything unless God allows him to do it. So the other episode where this is even more clearly spelled out is Job, right? God allows Satan to, give hardships to Job, okay? So God allows, or in the words of the author of Samuel, God incites David, but not in the sense of God's forcing him to do it, but God is allowing this to happen, which is making it happen, right? Okay. Because God's permissive will is the parameters for everything that happens. So it can also be understood as God is testing David. Okay. What's the big deal about a census? Okay. Well, when you count the people, especially in this time, but also in our time too, what are two things that you know how much you can get? Taxes and men to fight, right? If you know who's in all the towns, you can say, hey, your town needs to come up with this much money and this many young men to fight, right? It has been used over the centuries by tyrants, right? Especially in ancient times, to wield a godlike influence over the people, money and military power, right? So so census can be not a good thing for a king who serves the God of Israel. Okay. So the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army who were with him, "Go through all the tribes of Israel." Oh, here, the map disappeared again. To all the tribes of Israel. From Dan to Beersheba. Remember, that's just a phrase that means from the north to the south. And number the people, that I may know the number of the people. But Joab said to the king, "May the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" So even Joab, again, he's one of the few who challenges David. He's like, "Why do you want to do this?" But the king's word prevailed against Joab and the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to the number of the people of Israel. They crossed the Jordan and began from Aroer, and from the city that is in the middle of the valley toward Gad and on towards Jazer. So here's Gad and Jazer. Okay, they started out here. Okay, one of the tribes. Then they came to Gilead and to Kadesh in the land of the Hittites, and they came to Dan. And from Dan they went around to Sidon and came to the fortress of Tyre and to all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites. and they went out to the Negeb of Judah at Beersheba. So they had gone through all the land. They came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. So they were in Jerusalem. They start Joab and his census takers. They went to Gad. They went up to Dan, back down. Tyre and Sidon are up there. So they went up there. They came down this way, okay? And then the Negeb is down here. So they came all the way down to Beersheba. So they went in a counterclockwise motion. And it took them 9 months and 20 days. Okay. And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. Interesting numbers, just in this again with the kind of lurking foreshadowing of the rebellion, right? You have 800,000 in the 10 northern tribes and 500,000 in the 2 southern tribes. So Judah is a big tribe, but it's not enough to prevent the north from rebelling, right? Okay. All right. It's also interesting to note too, right? So we have 1.3 million men total, okay, who are able to fight, right? Because again, what are you interested in with the census? You're interested in taxes and young men to fight, who can wield a sword, okay. It's also, so I said that censuses have been used by tyrannical rulers. It's not a coincidence that in Luke's gospel, chapter 2, verse 1, what does it say? What went out from Rome? A census went out from Caesar Augustus to register the entire world, right? Again, that's not like, it's not like, hey, census 2020, or whatever. Not that can't be used against us too, right? But like, it's like, hey, sign up for the census so we can count you, It's like, no, like this can be wielded as a weapon of tyrannical power, right? And so, here we have, right, in Luke's gospel, Caesar is registering the entire world because he ruled the entire world, right? He's a powerful tyrant. He's the ultimate ruler of this world, right? And then Luke is like, but I'm actually going to tell you the story of the real king, who is not the ruler of the entire world, registering it in a census. I mean, again, the readers of the Gospels would have been aware of David's census, right, and what they mean, right? Luke's like, I'm going to tell you about, a couple going from one, as Bishop Barron says, dusty outpost of the empire to the other, and that's the real king, right? And it's the first few chapters of Luke are like the story of two kings, Jesus, and then the kind of implied king in the background, who's Caesar Augustus, right? Okay. So next, verse 10. But David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people. Remember, David's a man after God's own heart, and so he realizes that I've done wrong. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. David certainly was a sinner, but he also repented, right? And again, that's the best thing we can say, sketching out his character, right? And why he, I think, is set apart as from Saul, to kind of take it back to the beginning of study. O Lord, but now, O Lord, I pray to you, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. And when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say to David, Thus says the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, that I may do it to you. This is notable in that it's the only time in Scripture where someone is allowed to choose their punishment. Interesting. So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, Shall 3 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Notice that it's not exactly like there's the 333, okay? But like each thing is worse. So even though the pestilence or the plague is 3 days, right? It's more destructive, right? Famine is destructive, but like not as much, but over 3 years, right? Like that's a long time, right? And then your foes for 3 months, like I don't know that I'd want to be chased by my enemies for 3 months, right? So even though there's this kind of play right here, like it's not very obvious what's the best choice, right? Because even though famine on the face of it would be like, well, maybe we could survive on what we've got, right? Well, 3 years is like, now you're getting into some real serious, right? Then David, now consider and decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But let me not fall into the hands of men. So what David ends up choosing is option number 3, the pestilence. And here's his logic, and it's actually really good logic. Again, David learning a lesson. He's like, well, God is merciful. Maybe, he will have mercy on us. But if we're being pursued by my enemies, men are not always merciful, right? And I'm sure he's figuring with the famine, right? What is that going to lead to? Wars and insurrections, right? So he's like, the pestilence, even though it's the shortest, but it's also going to be the most deadliest right away. God, I hope that God's known for being kind and merciful. Maybe he'll have mercy on us, okay? Verse 15, so the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died the people from Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 men. Again, Dan to Beersheba, the whole land. And when the angel stretched forth his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord repented of the evil and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, it is enough, now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people and said, behold, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray you, be against me and against my father's house. So again, you know that whole great army that you thought you had, well, 70,000 are gone, right? Not an insignificant number. And then again, what's part of the lesson of David here? What does David do? He intercedes for his people, right? He realizes, he's praying for them, right? Lord, have mercy on them. Don't punish them for my sin, right? Again, going back to this frame of how did David learn these lessons? He learned it the hard way, right? And again, we might think of that as really unfortunate, but they had a much more tied in sense of the corporate entity of the people, right? They were much more communitarian than us. So it's not so weird that and even in our own day, right? The decisions of the president do affect us, right? Maybe not, we don't necessarily think of the president as we're his, corporate body in the same sense as they did, but there is something to that even in our day, right? Even more so here, where it's this is my family, right? And I made the mistake, punish me, not them. Okay. All right. And then the last thing, what about this threshing floor? And this might be something that you thought it sounds like kind of a throwaway thing, but it's actually not at all. Okay. And that's where we'll end this all. That's where the book ends. And Gad came that day to David and said to him, go up, rear an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Not through this narrative here, but through Chronicles and Kings, the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite was on Mount Moriah. So Mount Zion is where David's city is, okay? This is Mount Moriah. So the threshing floor of this guy, Araunah, okay, is on Mount Moriah. What's significant about that? It's the site of the temple, right? And by the way, what's a threshing floor? That might not be something that we really know about today, right? Yeah, it's where it's a platform on a hilltop, on a hill, right? I don't know, maybe this is the artist's rendition, right? The threshing floor. It's a platform on a hill where you take a winnowing fork. I've never done this, but I've read about it because I've read about the Bible, right? And you thresh the wheat so that the wheat is separated from the chaff, because the wheat is the kernel is what you want, right, for grain, but the chaff is worthless. And since the chaff is lighter than the grain, the wind, you have to be in a windy area, right? They don't have they don't have a big fan like we would do it today. I don't even know how we do it today. It's all done by machines, right? But you'd have to go into the threshing floor, and as you thresh the wheat, the chaff would be blown away. Okay, So this would have been a common thing, right? I mean, it's everywhere. Well, this particular threshing floor is on Mount Moriah, on the mount next to Mount Zion. Okay, so this story, right? Again, on the face of it, it's like seems kind of like a throwaway thing, right? He went up to the threshing floor. The angel stopped at the threshing floor. This is the story of how David acquired the property that became the temple, right? And so it's like here at the end of the book, right? It's looking forward to what's to come. The temple is going to be built here, right? Again, this is another example of God bringing good out of evil. The census was bad, but God brings good out of evil. And again, within the structure of this chiastic structure, David learned some. How did he learn his lessons? Right, that were in the middle. Right, he had to learn some lessons the hard way. Okay. And then before I move on, the other thing too about well, here I'll just read it first, and then we'll talk about that because we'll end on that note. So David went up at Gad's word as the Lord commanded, and when Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Araunah went forth and did obeisance to the king with his face to the ground. No, and by the way, he's a Jebusite, so he's not an Israelite. Okay, that's part of why David doesn't like have his he can't just tell him, "Hey, you're my subject," right? You know. And Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor of you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people." Again, notice there's a kind of parallel here, like, you know, we need to appease God. But this time that David knows he actually does need to, right? He knows that he's sinned and he needs to do something to make amends for his transgression. It's not like that first story where it's kind of unclear. It seems very pagan. His understanding of God seems very pagan, like a tit for tat kind of thing. David knows that I actually need to do something to make amends to God. Then Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of oxen for the wood." So Araunah says, because what's David going to do here? Sacrifice. Remember, what is, I have no space. David is a priest king. So in order to make recompense to God, he needs to offer sacrifice. Okay? And so Araunah says, "Sure, great. Yeah, here's the oxen. You can even use their yoke for the wood. You got all the stuff you need here for a sacrifice on Mount Moriah." Which, by the way, another thing that's important about this mountain, where did the sacrifice of Abraham take place, of Isaac? On this mountain, on Mount Moriah. Okay, so David is, acting like Abraham. Okay, and Araunah, this foreigner, says, "Hey, go for it. Right? I got, you can even use my ox and my wood." "All this, O king," Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, "The Lord your God accept you." But the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will buy it of you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord heeded supplications for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. Okay. Last few fascinating things here, right? Okay. So what has David learned? This is really important, right? What does he say there? "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing." David recognizes here at the very end of Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, that he, like his relationship with God doesn't come cheap. God blesses him. God is my strength and my salvation, but he's not my mascot. He's not my genie, right? He's not just on my team, nothing asked, right? No, like being a follower of God needs to cost me something. What's one of the problems that Israel will run into in the temple, right? Is they will offer the sacrifices, but it doesn't cost them anything. They don't actually change their way of life, right? They offer the sacrifices as like to placate God, like the pagans do, and God says, I don't want any of your sacrifices. Like, yes, you need to offer them, but if it doesn't cost you something, if it doesn't change your heart, then they're worthless to me, right? Rend your hearts, not your garments, right? It's not throw away the sacrifices, but sacrifice without it costing isn't going to get the job done. And David has learned that lesson. This foreigner gives him everything he needs to do the sacrifice, and he says, no, I'm going to pay you, which I was trying to look. There's no real way to exactly figure out how much, 50 shekels of silver, but I'm sure it was a lot, right? It costs him something. Okay. And this is the first sacrifice under the Davidic kingship that takes place on Mount Moriah, because David buys the land, he buys the threshing floor, and then he offers the sacrifice. And what is going to happen on this mount for the next, at least 500-ish years? Sacrifices in the Solomon Temple, and then it's going to be destroyed, right? And then they're going to rebuild it, and the sacrifices will continue all the way up until the time of Jesus. Okay. So the other thing too, and we talked about, why did I talk about threshing floors? Okay. The other thing that is lost on us, but is important to note, threshing floors are symbolic in the Bible of divine judgment. We even have, we kind of use the phrase, right? You separate the wheat from the chaff, right? So in a threshing floor, you've got the good and the bad. Like, there's two ways: the way of life, the way of death. So threshing floors throughout the Bible are a symbol of divine judgment. Remember Uzzah, the guy who touched the ark and he died? Guess where he did that? On the threshing floor of Nacon, right? So it was like God's judgment, right? So threshing floors are important for that. Okay, now, and this is where it all comes to, like, the point where, for us, everything starts with and everything goes back to, right? Okay. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 12, John the Baptist says this of Jesus. He says, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So what does John the Baptist compare Jesus to? Someone who's doing the threshing on the threshing floor, right? Here is God, and he has come to give his divine judgment. He's separating the wheat from the chaff. You're either team wheat or you're either team chaff. 2 years ago when we did Revelation, we said at the end of Revelation, you're either on team bride or team whore. Well, here you're on either team wheat or team chaff. Okay, sounds a little nicer. Sort of, yeah. Well, it's important though. But I don't know. The wheat chaff metaphor is not as, doesn't have the same punch, right? But it's important, right? Okay, so John the Baptist says that of Jesus, right? Jesus has come, right? Jesus himself says, right? I've come not to bring peace but the sword, right? Why? Simeon, at the same spot on Mount Moriah, Simeon will say at the presentation, he'll say to Jesus' parents, behold, this child is set for the fall and rising of many in Israel. Because what does Jesus come to do? Who is Jesus? He's Yahweh who has come to separate the wheat from the chaff. And how does he do it? Right? Well, yeah, because Jesus forces a choice, especially for the Jews of Jesus' day. But I would argue even for us today, for people that either you're with Jesus or you're for Jesus. He has sayings that are a lot like that, right? You're either with me or you're against me, okay? So Jesus forces a choice. You're either with God or you're against God. You're either team wheat or team chaff, okay? Well, how does Jesus do this? Well, again, the wheat from the chaff, right? David offering a sacrifice. What is David doing? He's offering a sacrifice to take away a plague, okay? And he recognizes that it needs to cost him something. Well, later, the son of David, the new David, will come to this same spot and stand on this same mountain and say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And John has an aside that he was talking about the temple of his own body. And then what does he do? He's led out of the city walls of Jerusalem, okay, the city of David, and He offers a sacrifice. He's crucified, hung, exposed to the elements, a shameful death, just like in this story, right? Not just like it, but like there's a parallel there. And why does Jesus offer his blood? Why does he offer the sacrifice of his, to take away the plague of our sins, right? So here, and this is why this is, and again, when this was written, like, it's not like the author of Samuel was like, yeah, this guy Jesus is going to come along and do all this. He didn't know about that, right? But here we have, in the very last paragraph of the very last chapter, this story that on the surface of it seems like kind of a throwaway thing. Like, now granted, people in the Old Testament would have understood some of the significance of this. But think about in the New Testament, right? The Jews who would have been looking back on, like, yeah, like, they're reading their, scriptures, and they're like, yeah, the threshing floor. Yeah, Jesus kind of, yeah, do you remember what John the Baptist said about he's got a winnowing fork? You're like, I get it now, right? It all clicks. Because here, right, this last chapter points forward to the hope that Jesus will bring by being the new David, who has come to take away the sins of the world.